It's 2030, and the sun is setting on a small island on the Pacific Ocean. In a house by the beach, a 6-year-old boy is playing with a set of matches while his grandmother takes an afternoon nap. The little boy strikes a match, but when it burns his fingers, he drops it on the couch. The boy takes one look at the scorched fabric and decides not to stick around for punishment. He rushes out the door and sprints through the trees, making his way up the winding path to the hill. His grandmother awakes to the smell of burning cloth. She runs into the living room, calling to her grandson. When she realizes that he's gone, she starts to panic. The radio's been warning about an approaching storm. She gets her walking stick and rushes out of the house, calling to him. Outside, the wind is starting to whip the leaves, and the waves on the shore are crashing. She doesn't know where her grandson has gone, and she doesn't have long before the storm hits. Hello everyone, I'm David Finnegan, and I'm a playwright and performer from Ngunnawal country in Australia. I work with research scientists, usually climate and earth scientists, and I make performances and games about complex systems and the changing planet. This show was created thanks to Google and the Understanding Risk community. It's based on research I did with scientists at the Earth Observatory Singapore when I was in residence there, looking at natural hazard crises in the Pacific region. Now today we're going to take a look at the challenge of risk reduction and risk management in the instance of a disaster taking place in the year 2030. Risk is often measured using the formula hazard times exposure times vulnerability. Hazard in a risk assessment refers to the chance of a natural hazard occurring in a particular area. And because you folk look particularly competent today, we're going to look at a multi-hazard situation. 2 hazards taking place at the same time, a typhoon and an earthquake. Exposure refers to the things that are important to communities, including people, that could be impacted by hazards. In our story, what will be affected will be the buildings and people in this fictional community, which could be in Southeast Asia, or it could be along the coast of Queensland in my homeland. Vulnerability describes how susceptible the things we care about are in the event of a crisis. And that's what we're going to particularly focus on today. There are multiple stages in the disaster risk management cycle, from long-term planning all the way through to emergency management during the event. We're going to look at each phase in turn. You're going to make some decisions that will impact what happens during this disaster, and ultimately, what will happen to the grandmother and her grandson. Now, I'm going to need a couple of people to make decisions at different points in this game. So if you're willing to take that on, I'll ask you to raise your hand. So the way you do that is you click on your participant tab and you'll see a little gray button that says raise hand. So I'll ask people who are interested to put their hand, raise their hand, keep your hand raised. And at a couple of points throughout this piece, I'm going to ask someone to turn on their microphone and video. And I'll ask you to make a simple decision between 2 options, A or B. And I'll ask you why you've made that choice. So please go ahead and raise your hand, and we'll get to those choices in a moment. Again, you can find that by clicking on the participant button and seeing the raise hand option. Now, the best time to start planning for a disaster in 2030 is right now. So we'll begin by inviting Monica. Joe is going to ask you to turn on your microphone and camera, and you're going to be our first volunteer who'll be taking care of a group of scientists. So the year is 2020, it's right now. And a group of scientists, which is all of you, have been tasked with making a risk model for this small island in the Pacific. Risk models combine engineering and statistical data to simulate the potential impact of a hazard on an area. It's really important these models use accurate information and quality data. Now, there are 2 steps in creating a risk model. First of all, gathering the data, and secondly, engaging the community. We'll look first of all at gathering the data. So you're all the scientists carrying out this assessment, but Monica is going to be the spokesperson. Monica, can you hear me?
I can hear you, even though I did not bank on being a spokesperson.
No one banks on being a spokesperson for scientists, something that happens against your will. Okay, so you're in charge of this team of scientists, despite your best efforts, and you're planning how to do this work. You've got two options. You can either get on the ground, you can send these scientists to this island to visit the sites, check the buildings, and survey things directly. Or you can do the research remotely using survey maps and architectural blueprints. Now, obviously it's more expensive to get on the ground, and you only have a limited budget and also limited people. And of course, there's lots of other places that you need to do risk assessments for. So it's going to be much more expensive doing that first option, but it is probably going to be more effective for this particular case. So what do you feel like you're going to do?
Well, I would get on the ground, and I would hope that what I'm learning on the ground can also benefit in terms of social dynamics, the other assignments that I'm doing elsewhere.
Fantastic. Okay, so you're going to dive in and send those scientists to get on the ground directly. Okay, fantastic. So well done. You send your team onto the ground, you survey the sites directly, you measure and take your surveying instruments, and your data gathering is exceptional. Now, unfortunately, you've spent a lot of your budget on this project, so there are other sites that you won't get to visit this time around, but that's okay. You've made the best decision that you could with the finances and resources you had. So thank you. Joe, you can send Monica back to the group now. Thank you, Monica. Okay, so the second part of the risk modeling process is engaging with the community who will be using this model. So once you've collected this data, you can either move on to the next project, or you can spend additional time engaging the community on the accuracy and usability of this research. Now, this is not a decision that gets made by one spokesperson. This is a choice that every scientist makes individually. So all of you are going to make this choice together. You are each one of the scientists involved in this project. You're a very busy scientist, you're hardworking, and you're chronically underfunded, of course. Now, you've just finished this data gathering process on the ground, thanks to Monica. So you can either stick around in the community and go out and hold meetings, run workshops to engage people with the research and co-create that final report with the community, or you can work remotely. You can head off, deliver the report electronically, and focus on your next project. And that'll free you up to do other risk assessments elsewhere. Now, working with communities is slow and time consuming, and there's not always a lot of funding for it. And it's going to mean you have less time and resources to do other projects, but it is important. If you head off and deliver the report remotely, that frees you up to do other projects, and hopefully you can find another time to come back to this community, do that engagement, maybe when there's not a pandemic happening. Although if you put it off now, realistically, who knows if it'll ever happen. So each of you are going to make this decision individually. But here's the thing. We need a critical mass of scientists on the ground for that community engagement to work. If 90% or more of you commit to working on the ground with the community, then that means you are able to co-create that risk model. If fewer than 90% stick around on the ground, then unfortunately you won't have the expertise on hand to really make that report locally relevant and accurate. So Joe's going to launch a poll now, and you're going to have one choice: to go into the community or go remotely. This is an anonymous poll, so don't feel pressured by anyone else. No one will know what you chose. Follow your heart. What would you do in this situation? I'm going to give you 10 seconds to make that choice. Okay, fantastic. All right, Joe, can we see what people chose? So 80% of people chose to stick around in the community, which is great. 4 out of 5 of you. 20% of the scientists in the project decided that they would head off and get started on other projects. So unfortunately, you didn't have all the expertise on hand that you needed to make a really effective co-created report. So what you've done instead is make a 50 megabyte PDF on a website that probably very few people are ever going to read. So that's obviously not ideal. But on the plus side, a lot of you did head off and get started on other work that's also really important. So that's great. Flash forward. It's 2030. The storm is continuing to build. The little boy has climbed up the hill as he's been told to do during a typhoon. He's lashed by wind and rain. He's lost his bearings when he suddenly spots a building. It's the local schoolhouse. No one's there, but the door is unlocked, and he pushes his way inside. He huddles on the ground in the classroom while the wind shrieks by the windows. The storm is getting worse. And then, suddenly, the ground starts to shake. Meanwhile, his grandmother is still outside in the worsening storm. Lashed by rain, she's knocked to her knees. She pushes herself to her feet and finds a tree to shelter under. The storm is too severe to go any further, or to make it back to the house. She waits for the worst to pass, but just as she huddles under the tree, the ground begins shaking. It's an earthquake. A branch breaks off over her head and falls on her. She's partly trapped. She can only pray that someone will come to find her and her grandson before the storm gets any worse. So, back in 2020, the scientists produced a risk model. What's the point of a risk model? Well, to answer that, we're going to grab our second volunteer, and I'm going to ask Stephen Dittmeyer. Joe, if you can ask Stephen to turn on their microphone and camera, that would be great. One reason to create a risk model is so that policymakers can use it to reduce key vulnerabilities and prepare for potential disasters. So we're going to jump forward 5 years to 2025. And Stephen, I'm going to ask you to be the mayor of this local area. So congratulations.
Thank you.
So you're the mayor for this area. You've been in office for nearly 4 years, and you've fought corruption, you've made tough decisions, and you've improved the lives of people in this community in all sorts of ways. The people of this town really appreciate your hard work. Now you're coming up for re-election at the end of the year, and unfortunately, your opponent has made a lot of unrealistic promises and told some lies, and right now you're neck and neck in the polls. So you only have time for one more project, and hopefully it's something that will win some votes. You can either make sure that building codes have been adhered to across the region and construction is up to standard, or you can open a new orphanage. Now, before you answer, back in 2020, a group of scientists did a risk assessment of the area. And it seems that they went really deep. They all got on the ground. They surveyed the buildings in person, and they found that there were some real concerns around safety in some local buildings. Luckily, you have several degrees because the report they wrote was pretty inaccessible and left on a website where no one could find it. But you have the technological skill to understand what they said, and it looks like there are some problems. So you can work on building codes, or you can open an orphanage. And I warn you, enforcing building codes is not going to make you very popular, and opening an orphanage is going to address a definite need.
Tough choice.
Yes. I'm sorry to put you in this bind.
Thank you. With my background, I would want to get the building codes up to date, because
okay.
I'm aware that that structurally there's some real issues on the island, and we have problems.
Okay, great. Well, excellent decision. Thank you, Stephen. Okay, so fantastic. Joe, you can send Stephen back to the group. Good decision. So you spend your last months as mayor annoying everyone, making sure the buildings are safe, there's construction everywhere, it's noisy, inconvenient, expensive, everyone's angry with you. Your opponent, meanwhile, opens an orphanage and gets some great publicity. When the election comes, you lose by almost 5 votes to 1. I'm very sorry. Okay, so you've made your decisions. Now we're going to put these together to see what happens to our grandmother and grandchild. When it came to data gathering, you got on the ground and collected all the data you could. When it came to communicating risk, your report was not very accessible. And when it came to addressing vulnerabilities, you decided that taking care of buildings was absolutely critical. So where does that leave us for our emergency response in 2030? It's 2030, 24 hours before the storm hits. In a cramped office on the island, the chiefs of the emergency services are holding a last-minute planning meeting. They're standing around a map asking where they should send their rescue teams. Where's the most vulnerable areas? Now, these teams don't have anything to do with the scientists or local governments who put those models together back in 2020. And unfortunately, none of them have had time to sit down and read this whole 50 megabyte report. So they haven't combined their local knowledge in a useful way, and their planning is more haphazard than it should be. For example, there's no documentation saying that there's an elderly woman and a little boy living on the east side of the island, and they decide not to send an emergency team there. As the wind and rains begin to ease, an orange boat pushes through the surf and the rescue team sees an elderly woman trapped by a falling branch. By the time they manage to free the grandmother from the branch, she's in very bad condition. They rush her straight to the clinic, but it's going to be a long, slow recovery for her. Meanwhile, up on the hill, the wind is howling, the rain is growing harder, and now the earth is starting to shake. The boy hides in the doorway of the schoolhouse, as he's been told to do. How secure is the building? Thankfully, 5 years ago, the school building was reinforced as part of the mayor's wave of building renovations. The school holds firm amidst the earthquake. The little boy whispers a silent thank you to the mayor, who was so unfairly kicked out of office by an ungrateful population. The boy will be safe in the schoolroom until the storm has passed. It's a few days later. The storm has passed, the floodwaters are subsiding, and people are beginning to return home to their houses to begin the long, hard job of repairing and rebuilding. Time to think about what's next. On the island, an old shopping centre has been turned into an evacuation centre. The grandmother is sitting on a bed, massaging her shoulder, still sore from the injury, when suddenly she hears a familiar shout. Her grandson races into her arms. They hug fiercely, and the little boy promises to never again play with matches. Meanwhile, on the other side of the island, a boat pulls up to the dock and a group of scientists disembark. They're here to begin a new risk assessment to start thinking about how to build back better. And the cycle of risk management begins anew. So, well done everyone. We've looked at just a couple of the challenges and trade-offs facing people in disaster risk management. Now, of course, we've taken some artistic liberties, but I hope that it illustrates how many influences on decision-making there can be. This turned out to be a happy story, but for many thousands of people across the world in situations like these, that's not the case. The decisions that are made today about risk assessment, data, community engagement, and so on can change how a disaster might impact an individual, a town, or an entire nation. So I'm grateful that you've allowed me to walk through some of the decisions that each of you have to make in your professions. The Understanding Risk community's good work, I hope, will enable more positive outcomes for our future world. Thanks again to Google for supporting this session and to all of you for coming along. Thanks and have a great day.